Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Fraud Michael Skiba here. I'd like to welcome you to episode 5 of DFTV. We are live. Very, very excited for this episode. We have a rock star guest with us today, too, to explore this exciting topic. But before we dive in, just a couple quick things. The DFTV format is growing. So what I'd like to just, as I always mention in the beginning, is please reach out to me with content ideas, guest ideas. We're booking into the fall now, so please let me know. You can reach out to me. I'm all over social media, so please do that. Very excited to see what we have content-wise coming up. Secondly, we love engagement, so we want to hear feedback on this episode, but also specific items as well. Chat is wide open, so I threw a kind of a softball question in there, but it's really about you too. So we want to try to increase awareness on this issue. So definitely, I'm going to monitor the chat throughout the next half hour. So very excited to get started. So I want to introduce. We have a special guest all the way from Singapore. So it's 10:30 my time, guys. 10:30 your time PM. So you had a way ahead of you. So thanks for joining. First off, appreciate it. You look great for 10:30 PM. I have to tell you.
Well, it was either this or the jammies. We're very formal over here in Singapore.
Very, very nice. You have the pajamas on the bottom, right? The Zoom.
Yeah, exactly.
Zoom outfit.
Yeah,
okay.
Up top. It's party.
Duly noted. I do too, but we're not even going to go there. So, but no, glad to have you. Glad to see you again. Last time I saw you, I know it was in Malaysia, so it's nice to actually see you again, albeit virtually. But I want to introduce Guy, because Guy has an extensive background and one that's going to add some really nice depth to this topic. So Guy has 16 years experience, financial crime compliance, focused on utilities, entity resolution, banking, KYC. Prior to Swift, he was responsible for financial crime compliance across the Americas, UK, Nordics. In his career, he worked for LexisNexis, Wolters, Kluwer, Bankers Almanac, now Acuity. And with the Metropolitan Police Terrorist Financial Investigations Unit on a joint venture. He also sits on the RegTech Committee of Singapore FinTech Association, and he currently leads Asian Pacific Financial Crime Compliance, Intelligence, and Cyber teams at Swift. So awesome background, Guy, and really, really glad to have you here today as we dive into this. So let's dive in. So let's first off talk about, our idea here with this case. So the case of Captain Garcia. And I think what we want to do, let's talk about some stats first, and then you and I can dive into there's so many aspects here, but there's the psychological aspect, which is kind of an area that I've been involved in, and of course you at the financial aspect of that whole piece. I think it's so exciting to get into that. So let's do that. But before we do that, let's just dive into romance scams in general first. So first off, it's really interesting because if you look at the stats, romance scams average in the U.S. about 150 million a year. So it really is a huge problem. They estimate most scams are about $2,600 a piece. And people over 70, it's about 1,000. So this is not like a couple $20-$30 here or there. This is big money. So we know it's a problem. In your area, I was looking at some stats in Singapore. It went from 2013 from 81 cases all the way up last year to 649. Right. So this is huge.
It's a great business.
Yeah, and you had, and to that point, you guys had a big case. It was in 2018. It was a multi-law enforcement public-private agency endeavor, right? It was originated in Kuala Lumpur. 19 arrested, over 19 million. They had ties all over, internationally. So I think it's such an important topic to talk about. So let's dive into this crazy case. All right. So this is the case of Captain Garcia. So just to bring everybody up to speed on this, you and I know about this. So we're going to take a trip across the world. Hopefully we could have done that in person, from LA to Syria and Japan. So a woman by the name of FK originated in Japan, or based in Japan. So she apparently started a relationship with a U.S. Army captain. This Captain Garcia, based out of Syria, started a 10-month online relationship. leading into romance, basically. So he then got into talking about how he has these diamonds in Syria, wants to somehow export those, and needs her help in doing that. So short version, there are about $200,000 that she was duped out of. No diamonds, no captain, resulted in some arrest by the FBI in LA, but they had ties into Nigeria. So let's talk about this real quick. So Guy, what's your first impression of let's talk about romance scams and from your perspective, even where you are geographically in
Sure. Well, the reason I when we talked about this, I thought romance scams would be interesting is, I love the classics. And to me, look, I'm a Brit by birth, so I like the historical association. And for me, romance scams, the earliest iterations were the kind of Spanish letters during the French Revolution. So wealthy merchants or just wealthy people would receive a letter from this gang saying that the count or countess of whatever was imprisoned, and if you could help, towards bribing guards or smuggling these people out, this count or countess would obviously forever be in your debt. Royal patronage, diamonds, precious stones, huge rewards would be yours. And this has kind of evolved to, we all know about the kind of 419s, right? The 419 emails where it's usually granny, isn't it, that's got access to the internet, and there's some nice young man that if she pays just 5,000 into an account, because of some whatever snafu with escrow, they could pay her back $100,000 in cash, and it's usually to do with diamond mines in Western Africa. And now the 419s, named after the Nigerian Penal Code, are more of a kind of footnote in history. And they're even kind of lampooned on, adverts on Facebook. And I think for me, romance scams are just a natural evolution of how we progress, and how there's an evolution of a core scam, which is just through social engineering and our current state of play, particularly under a pandemic. I think it's just more relevant than ever before. I think Captain Garcia case, for me, really captures the imagination, because if you look into the case, it's so wildly fantastic that there are diamonds that need to be smuggled out by this US officer in Syria. He's not allowed a ham phone, so he can't FaceTime his new love in Japan, because phones aren't allowed in Syria or on the base. So it's all over email. And if you look at the case, the details of this are that he's wounded, and he introduces her to an associate that's a Red Cross official. I mean, it's like something out of Romancing the Stone meets Mills and Boone. I mean, it's crazy. And when they actually made the arrest, as you rightly said, Michael, I think there was actually 80 people that were indicted. There were 17 in the US, and of course a much larger sort of, I guess the base of the iceberg overseas in Nigeria or in other jurisdictions that were more difficult. And although they took poor old FK for $200,000, when they were alleged to have stolen 6 million US, from these specific scams, and I think they had another 40 million attempted. So, this is not a cottage industry, which I think is like through the popular programs like Catfish, that implies that it's a kind of, you have just random people in the street. These are highly organized. And I think what I like to talk about in terms of romance scams in Asia, they're definitely on the rise, as you pointed out. And I think particularly under the pandemic, and just how we've moved now to a new generation with kind of millennials in particular, where online dating is the norm. It's not strange. And I think this type of occurrence in Asia has seen a resurgence, particularly with, I think, some of the geopolitical issues. You have lots of variations on this scam, and it is very common here for individuals to pay their cell phone bill, perhaps contribute to a family member overseas, right? So there's a kind of veneer of acceptance which is being manipulated. And I think a real challenge for a lot of the banks in Asia, particularly in Singapore, is they've invested a lot as fin crime teams in terms of awareness, which, you know, you talk about in your book as like a deterrent factor that, you know, the teller, right, that would be able to spot, one would hope, a customer that's under some degree of duress or unusual stress, alongside, I would assume, a very unusual transaction that they were trying to or transfer. But I think romance scams, I think we should talk about them because, you know, in many frauds, it's a faceless crime, right? If you're defrauding an insurer, you know, well, I'm paying off my premium, they charge too much, CEOs make multi-millions in bonuses, it's a huge company, you know, who's really losing out? Whereas here, you know, these are individuals that are not just, in the case of poor old FK, I mean, she didn't want to use her real name, and $200,000 was what she gave this gang of very good fraudsters, and she was borrowing money off family or friends to pay this to help her lover, Captain, well, lover to be, I suppose, Captain Garcia. But there is a very human element to this, and that's why I think it really tugs at the heartstrings, because you're not just defrauding someone of their money, you're defrauding someone of their emotional investment as well. So there is a very clear victim, and I think what jumped out at me when I was kind of reading the case notes is the level of emotional stress and quite literally heartbreak that this woman suffered at the hands of this. And yeah, I mean, it's very topical. Under the pandemic, this is absolutely on the rise. And, you know, there's a ton of, which I thought would be interesting to discuss with you with your background, right? I mean, we have generations of people that are no longer in this part of the world going through perhaps more of an arranged marriage approach to future partners. And there's a ton of people that are very career focused and I guess very lonely. And what I've heard a lot from a pandemic, maybe not on a romance situation, but people wanting to achieve something during very severe lockdowns across different Asian countries. You know, one of the things is, I guess, a new relationship. You have a whole new attack vector of individuals where there is a very clear need, you know, to fall in love, to hope to meet up with this person. And, you know, there's the perfect camouflage for this for these individuals. Like, I physically can't see you, we're in lockdown, I cannot leave my house, etc., etc. So, you know, I genuinely think this is something that's going to be on the rise. And what's quite I think nice about Singapore is, so you mentioned that, so it's the 3 police agencies. It was the I think it was the Royal Malaysian Police, the Hong Kong Police Force, and then CAD in Singapore, which is White Collar Crime Division. So it was great because it was a kind of, you know, sort of cross-jurisdictional approach to tackle this gang. But that gang were massive, and these people are highly organized. This is being duplicated time and time and time again. Yeah, I mean, they were responsible for, I think, I'll have to check my notes, but I think it was about 11 million or something like that US in terms of successful frauds with complicated setups, multiple cell phones, different sort of accounts, all forms of instruments in terms of being able to receive this, bank accounts, digital wallets, etc., etc. And I think it's absolutely on the rise. And I think a traditional approach now needs to be updated, which is, you know, let's have awareness raising kind of roadshows. And that's something that happens in Singapore quite a lot. And I think there was an employee at OCBC Clementi that got an award for spotting a vulnerable customer, a much older gentleman that was trying to make a $81,500 transfer, which is obviously very unusual. And she stepped in to query this. And it was that curiosity, it was that awareness that this is unusual. And I just worry that this is going to be increasingly difficult, that human interaction factor is now going to increasingly become absent as we move into an increasingly digital engagement sphere between customers and banks. And it's, it may not be right up there with sanctions exposure or some of the other frauds I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's I think it's one that really tugs at the heartstrings, and that's why I think it's one we should talk about.
Fantastic. And I apologize too. I was just checking the chat, and I know that I've heard that there's maybe a sound situation, so I'll try to monitor that. Hopefully, it's got better. I just put a couple things while you're chatting, guys. Keep me in the loop on that. Because now I'll just have to go silent and guide to be on the talking. There'll be no issues today, I'm sure. But yeah, no, boy, there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. I think you get a lot of it. And, one of the things that interests me about it is psychological aspect, right? Because one of the things that we know is, this is a vulnerable population, right, that we're targeting. But I mean, that was traditionally where it was. But now we're seeing it because, again, so many more people are using data environments. Now we see it slowly growing into this.
Michael, could you switch the audio? You're coming over as very faint.
It's very faint. Okay, yeah. Let me pop over again.
Yeah, that's better.
Of course, and this is the challenge with live, everybody.
That's
like
it.
anything
That's it.
happen.
That's it. Great. Much
Yeah,
better.
sorry, folks. We'll have to tech check this because everything, of course, worked when we teched it. So I think Murphy entered the room somewhere. So I do apologize, and we'll have to work on that. So just keep me in the loop, everybody, Guy, and the group as well. So the vulnerability aspect of it is just an area that, of course, I really love to dive into, and I think it's the vulnerable population. We know that, right? We know in every area of fraud that we deal with, whether it's banking, whether it's insurance fraud, we know it's all about that vulnerable population that gets targeted. And I think that's what's interesting. And I'll give you a perfect example. Just 2 weeks ago, I received on LinkedIn a friend request, and this is usually how it happens. And it starts with a hi, and then you go in and it's the same profile. It's usually a picture of, a highly attractive person, and the profile is very interesting modeling. I mean, this is a typical profile that they follow, right? So it's interesting because this has happened to me before. Here's a little tip too. One thing you can do is if you look at that picture, you can see the picture looks very staged. It almost looks too perfect. My LinkedIn picture, yours. I mean, yes, they're formatted, but what you can do is if you look at the image address, if you copy the image address, and then if you go do a Google search with the address, not with the picture, but you do a Google photo search, it actually came up as the Wikipedia definition of girl. So it was actually funny, but this is what happens, and this is how it starts. Not that I'm a vulnerable population, but just to the point, this is what disturbs me, because traditionally that is the focus of fraud, but now it could be anybody. It could be anyone that has that little sense of whether it's loneliness or something's missing in a relationship, and then that starts the path of the emotional connection, right? And then it leads into, it's almost like it starts with my end, the psych, and then it ends up in your end, in the banking, financial world. So let's talk a little bit about, like the prevention from your perspective. Okay, so obviously, I mean, that's the world you live in, is financial crime prevention and filling gaps. So how? I mean, this is not a bank we're dealing about this or talking about. This is just the average person. So what are some clues maybe that can, help people, or that is being done in this area?
Okay, well, I mean, let me answer this question in two ways. So I think to the individuals, I mean, it's common sense wins out, really. So and a lot of these fraudsters pose, predictably as, positions that would infer trust. So Captain Garcia, member of the military, right? As a doctor, or as an accountant or a lawyer, perhaps, that travels a great deal. Randomly as an individual that through their job may be in a very remote location. So oil rig workers, stuff like this. So I think there's that. I think the basic tenet is, if you don't know someone and you haven't met someone, why on earth would you send the money, regardless of the, I presume, heart-wrenching story that accompanies that request? But there are other things, really. There's, the telltale signs you talked about, searching against a picture for its true provenance. There's even tales of, in many of cases, I would imagine the Captain Garcia tale was so elaborate, right? There had to be plot lines and, paragraphs. I mean, there must be a small manual for them to duplicate that. So, and these individuals are trying this on a repeat basis. So if you have a potential love interest that would like you to send them money, and they're an oil rig worker working out of in an oil field in whatever, why don't you Google that as a search term and see if you actually get some hits of other people having reported it. And I think another key one is look at the grammar and syntax. Sorry. So if there are inconsistencies, potentially they're using a translation engine, that sort of stuff, which may account for why it's a bit weird. And quite frankly, trust your instinct, right? If it doesn't add up and someone doesn't even want to FaceTime you, right? I mean, we all have the ability to FaceTime over, everyone's got camera phones, WhatsApp, whatever you want to call it, right? There's that capability. So if something doesn't add up, it probably doesn't. And then I would say, I guess if I put my banking hat on, all financial services firms are all of them have got behavior-based, triggers that maybe not necessarily geared towards fraud in this sense, but they would certainly, aside from the teller example I gave you earlier, an unusual high-value one-off payment to a new, account beneficiary, would potentially be stopped, or I would hope would raise some eyebrows. I guess I show my age that I've always traveled a lot for work. And I remember sort of 5-6 years ago, I had a global role, and guaranteed every time I traveled to a somewhat higher risk country, my Visa cards would be blocked. It's always very embarrassing when you're in a restaurant. And then you get a phone call from the, customer security team confirming that you're there and making that payment. So I think that, there is that secondary check and balance. But I think what worries me now is there's so many alternate payment methods. And increasingly, I think they, fraudsters know this. So they want you to, for example, charge, some of these chargeable credit cards, chargeable cash cards, because once that transfer's gone through, it's you can't recall it, right? It's untraceable. But I think in all of these cases, it's common sense always wins out. And I think the tragedy of romance scams is, the heart wants what it wants. And, that leads individuals to not listen to their sort of common sense, and you go with your heart as opposed to your head. And that's why I think romance scams are going to be around for a much longer period of time.
Yep. And a couple of things too. I just want to welcome some of our guests. We have Zakir, Zane, Eric, Dominic, Ingborg, Gary. Welcome everyone. Eric. So yeah, feel free to comment in the chat with any thoughts on this. And actually, Guy, I wanted to give a local example. A local bank here in New York, I was doing some work with, and they actually mentioned, because they know it's the kind of bank where they know all of their customers, and they saw it was not a full-blown data technology platform. They had to help detect an anomaly, but what they knew is they saw some withdrawals from a older gentleman's account. I think he was maybe 70 years old, and they had some wire transfers. They had 3 of them for about one was 3,000, and then one was 5, and then one was 7, of course, below that 10,000 threshold. And they just questioned him. They in a very tactful way, they just asked him what was going on, and it led to a discussion, and they actually prevented a romance scam. They got the local police involved, but just on a very, very low level. This is what we look for, when we look at every level in banking, financial crime. It's all about knowing that customer, the KYC, the anomalies, knowing that, right, you're traveling all over. I am too, but I still like my Starbucks. So, seeing a Starbucks in Malaysia and then Singapore is not unusual for maybe me or you, but But let's say you go somewhere else to a different coffee shop. So, I mean, it's an anomaly. It might not be a flag to initiate investigation, but those are something that at every scale need to be addressed. So very interesting. So banks can actually help with these romance scam preventions.
Yeah, I mean, every kind of fraudster, and I think it's very foolish to underestimate the other team. They're very good at what they do, and I think particularly the more well-organized criminal gangs. I mean, this is not a diversion. This is 100% of their focus and activity, and they play to a local audience, right? So if you take Hong Kong as an example, in Hong Kong, it's very common for even law-abiding citizens to have multiple bank accounts in slightly different versions of their name. So particularly in parts of Asia, you'll have the Chinese name that they were given at birth, and they'll adopt a Christian name as a first name to make it easier to do business, in English, right? So, in Hong Kong, many of our banks tell us that genuinely trying to identify individuals that are perfectly legal, law-abiding citizens. There's no mule activity. There's nothing like that. But it's common practice for them to have 7 or 8 different accounts under slight different variations of their names, right? And this stems from this legacy that Hong Kong has kind of been a party town, really. And you would have a lot of businessmen that would have a perhaps an expenses account, right, just for corporate expenses, the family account, a savings account, an investment account, and then potentially the account where that's for activities with the girlfriend. And it's very common in mainland China that different nightclubs and bars will have a girlfriend night and a wife night, right? Sort of echoing some of the stuff you see in Goodfellas, right? And I think that obviously complicates the situation. And I think romance scams, although quite titillating, this is, to me, this is a very human example of where fraud is going to go.
Yeah.
And let's not underestimate the impact of this pandemic. This is with us to stay, right? This is conservatively going to be around for 18 months.
Yeah.
There are vaccines. That's a whole other conversation, but I think that's going to be a while before they're made available, or even if you would want to take one. And I think increasingly, we're going digital. Yeah. Like the generation that every financial institution wants to attract is the Food Panda generation, where I click an app on my phone and I get a sandwich, I get a burger and fries, or whatever I want, right? And they don't want to go into. Why would they want to go into a bank branch and fill out tons of pieces of duplicate paper? So there's a huge transformational change, undergoing with fin crime. And although COVID-19 has been a tragedy for humanity, and it has, this has been an incredible accelerator to digitization and innovation in fin crime, fraud prevention, counter-terrorist professionals, where it's not an if, it's a when are you going to deploy this technology. It's necessity is the mother of all invention. So now there is a huge raft of firms taking biometrics, facial recognition technology that would map my picture in a live video like this to perhaps the image of me in this video to a static 8-10-year-old photo in a classic ID document. There's an influx of stress analysis, voice recordings, right, for when customers are phoning in, and the rise in online banking has been unprecedented. I know a good friend of mine, Dr. David Hadoon, is at Union Bank. They've seen a 7,000-fold increase in the opening of online accounts. 7,000. And I think UOB, which is a big name in Singapore, it's one of the 3 pillars. They've seen a 40% increase in use of their digital banking services. And let's be clear, right? We are not going to go back, right? When the pandemic is over, and I hope it's tomorrow, but when that's over, you're foolish. You're kicking yourself if you think that, customers are going to go, okay, fine, now it's done. I'll go back into the branch and I'll I'll have all my stuff stamped 5 times, and you get a copy, and I get a copy, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So for me, the implications for our profession is quite profound, in the sense that there's a whole raft now of talent requirements for tech-savvy professionals,
Yeah.
right? At the old school kind of ex-law enforcement, that kind of sniff test that you have as a practitioner, it's going to be like I think what traders saw as a transformation with quant-based trading programs.
Mm-hmm.
You still have traders, but you now have traders that combine that kind of gut instinct, that sniff test, with an output from an algorithm to make a decision in terms of whether to short it, long it, or do whatever. And I think that's where our profession is going, and that at the crux of this, to your point, is data. And increasingly, it's going to be about getting that data real estate right. And I know it's not right, because you fundamentally cannot send, and you quoted it earlier, an amount of $10,000. Even if it's perfectly legitimate and you've signed in all the forms, the transaction will still be blocked and checked, because we're using legacy-based rule systems. And all the sexy AI machine learning stuff that's going to change the world. I mean, it's not there yet in terms of a predictive state, and we're constantly playing catch up. And it's that honeymoon period that fraudsters, fin crime professionals are going to make use of, and that's genuinely what really worries me. But my hope is that we're going to continue to see this systemization of compliance, of fraud technology. And it's, these are going to start to integrate, to your point, to get really accurate behavior-based triggers, and to be able to identify, do you know what? Look, this customer of ours sends every 3 months a significant amount of money back home, or to an overseas investment account, or to whoever. And then, we're going to enter a much more real-time state where something can be checked, and then with a degree of probability and certainty released on a near real-time basis. And that, to me, is much more exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Guy, we should have booked more time. I noticed we actually went over a couple minutes here, because I feel like we didn't even really get into the, some of the things we wanted to talk about, but we hit the highlights. Yeah. And I think a couple of things just to close out with the points we made. I think one thing that you brought up, I just want to hone in on, is the information. Yeah, we all know, from our worlds, I just saw a study, there's going to be more information in the next 2 years than in all human history. So we need to manage it, just like you said, at every level, including things right down to romance schemes. And I think for us on the call, we all know those things to look out for, but also to spread awareness, because we know the elderly, and those that, they are a vulnerable population. So to us that have, maybe parents or someone that could be profiled as a vulnerable population here, make sure that the awareness is there, that these type of scams, are there. So Guy, I always like to end with a real quick question for you. So tell us something, a fun fact about Guy that we don't know about, not maybe even related to your profession. So.
Okay. I am obsessed. So I've started, one of the things I wanted to do during lockdown was to get a lot fitter. So I now do 3 sessions a week of kind of personal training. And my obsession is to be able to do a pistol squat unaided. If you don't know what that is, it is a horrific exercise. But that's my plan. Another 4 weeks, I'll be knocking out pistol squats like no one's business.
Very nice. Okay, we'll do a whole separate episode on that. That'll be our personal training. Yeah, very nice. So, Guy, how can anyone reach you if they need to?
Sure. So obviously, bear in mind, I'm in Singapore, so emails at this sort of time may not be answered. But the best way to get hold of me is via email. So it's Guy, GUY.Shepherd, SHEPPARD @swift.com, or you can add me on LinkedIn and we can message and then transfer it to the mainstream outlet. But yeah, love to hear from anyone if they've got any questions on some of the stuff we talked about today.
Fantastic, Guy.
Always, Dr. Fraud, thank you for having me. It's lovely to do stuff like this.
Thank you, 100%, Guy. And I know it's late for you, so I truly appreciate it. So thank you for your time. And to all the guests and everyone that joined, I want to thank you. Apologize about the audio. We'll have to troubleshoot that, but please follow up with us later. You can find me, of course, on LinkedIn and drfraud.org. All my contact information is there. Please send me info on follow-up sessions and guests and things like that. We'd love to hear your feedback on this session and others. So until next time, I'm Dr. Fraud and Guy. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you. Night.